Let's look at conflict with Native Americans today. Westward migration by white settlers is encouraged back east. Prominent newspaper editor Horace Greeley said this to the unemployed in 1867. And what he's saying there is that the West is opportunity. The West is economic opportunity for the economically disadvantaged. And he says you won't crowd anyone. The problem is, if you move west, you are going to be crowding someone. You would have been crowding Native Americans. Now, before the Civil War, all land west of the Mississippi River is considered one big Indian reservation. It's considered Indian country. All the eastern tribes had been moved there. They had been given guarantees of land. And in 1834, this is reinforced with the Indian Intercourse Act, which says that no white person could enter Indian country without a permit. Remember, the Constitution says that the federal government will deal with Native Americans. So if the federal government doesn't want you dealing with Native Americans, you're not going to get a permit. However, wagons to Oregon and California are traveling through this Indian country. As valuable resources are discovered, miners are traveling to Western lands and going through Indian country. And as transcontinental railroad talk heats up before the Civil War, there's concern about, there's Native Americans living on that land that white settlers want to develop and settle and enrich in their minds. And that leads to an abandonment of this one big reservation policy. There's a shift to concentrate Western tribes onto smaller lands. This starts with the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1851, where Native American tribes were given specific land under the treaty, and it allows white settlers to develop the area around them. This is a concentration policy of sort. It would provide white settlers with the most productive lands in the West and relocate Native Americans to the areas north and south of white settlement, out of Kansas and Nebraska specifically. Over the next decade, Native Americans are evicted from that red circle there in the middle and sent to reservations north or south of there. And the federal government is going to negotiate treaties with chiefs of the tribes, but the U.S. government really failed to understand that such tribes and chiefs were a mental construct of white people. That those chiefs didn't really exist in Indian culture, and that in most cases Native Americans didn't really recognize authority outside of their extended family, especially among Plains Indians, where smaller bands were really the unit of political organization, not large tribes where a chief could speak for a large number of people. That wasn't the reality. So in the late 1850s and into the 1860s, the United States government intensified its effort to herd Native Americans into smaller and smaller reservations in areas like the Dakota Territory. The concentration policy, however, directly conflicted with Plains Indian culture. Remember, these are the Native Americans who were used to moving around great distances throughout the year, following herds of bison, following their food source. That's not possible if you're concentrating Native Americans onto smaller and smaller reservations. But white settlers want and took Indian land. And what that means is Native Americans needed government protection. For example, they were completely pushed out of the Kansas and Nebraska area. One group, or two groups, the Cheyenne and Arapaho, were given land around Pikes Peak in Colorado. And in 1859, when gold and silver were discovered in the area, miners moved in, and that leads to conflict. It leads to warfare. The Cheyenne and Arapaho try to make peace. They come to the local U.S. military fort at Sand Creek to formulate a treaty. At Sand Creek, John Chivington leads the Colorado State Militia out to slaughter about 125 Indians who had gathered for a treaty. About 100 of those killed were women and children. They were flying an American flag over their temporary settlement, and they switched that to a white flag of surrender, but the slaughter did not stop. Now, the federal government condemns the Sand Creek massacre, but in name only, really. The Cheyenne and Arapaho still have to give up their lands. The Kiowa and the Comanche had also been promised their lands forever, but were forced off of them onto reservations so that their lands could be developed by white settlers. Why so many white settlers? One reason is the Homestead Act, remember, from 1862. It's going to bring many white settlers to the West, and those settlers only have to live on the land and farm it to get it. So there's a lot of people willing to try that to improve their situation better than maybe their opportunities back east. Also, the Transcontinental Railroad, when it's completed in 1869, is going to bring some settlers out west. It's going to bring some supplies for settlers out west. Some people might take a wagon to get themselves out there and send their supplies on train. Eventually, as more and more transcontinental railroads are built and the prices go down, people are going to travel by train, and they're going to have enough money to bring their supplies by train as well. That means even more white settlers into Indian Territory. If we look to the north in the Dakotas, the Sioux had been given the land in the Dakotas. The Sioux were one of the Great Plains tribes used to moving around great distances. But miners begin to move into Sioux territory as valuable minerals are discovered on Sioux land. And the federal government plans to build what was called the Bozeman Trail. This would be a trail connecting the mining towns that had sprung up in Sioux territory, but it's going to be right through Sioux hunting grounds. And construction of a significant trail like this is not going to be good for hunting wild game. So Chief Red Cloud, the Sioux chief in the area, ambushed the U.S. cavalry and kills Captain William J. Fetterman and 81 of his men. This is dubbed by Eastern newspapers as the Fetterman Massacre. And the Fetterman Massacre sets off the debate in the East as to what to do. Some people in government would like to see a true reform effort, a humanitarian effort. There's a lot of church groups leading this effort. They want a humane peace policy that focuses on education and civilizing Native Americans. Others see the Native Americans as hopeless, irredeemable savages and need to be wiped out through military action. Westerners often favored a stricter policy. But peace advocates win the debate, and the Indian Peace Commission of 1867 decides to end construction of the Bozeman Trail. But to avoid future conflicts, Native Americans in the Dakotas are going to be pushed onto smaller reservations. They're going to be given the out-of-the-way, in other words, worthless lands. And they're going to be encouraged, or rather forced, into farming. In other words, this is what peace advocates saw as civilizing Native Americans. And it's decided in that Peace Commission that all 54,000 Native Americans in the Dakotas will be pushed onto the Black Hills Reservation. And in the South, all 86,000 Native Americans are going to be moved to Oklahoma. Both of these areas, compared to surrounding areas, were very hard to farm. Both of these areas had government agents to supervise. And the same policy is going to be followed as Western settlement progresses further west in Utah, in Nevada, in Idaho, Arizona, in California, and in the Pacific Northwest.